Dr. Louisa Moats is a psychologist, literacy expert, and consultant. She also is an author of many scientific journal articles, books, and policy papers on topics of reading, spelling, and teacher preparation. As a licensed psychologist, she is evaluated and consulted with a variety of individuals who have presented with difficulties in reading, writing, and language. However, Dr. Moats is most well known for her work in the improvement of teacher education in understanding the language basis for reading and writing. They include letters, professional development, Language Live, blended literacy intervention, as well as speech to print language essentials for teachers. So dyslexia is classified as a learning disability. For those that are wondering, what is the clinical definition of a learning disability?
Well, there actually isn't a clinical definition of a learning disability. Rather, learning disability is defined as a category under special education law by which students can access needed services, including specialized instruction and accommodations to meet their unique needs. But in federal law, there are, I think, something like 8 different subcategories under the term learning disability. Learning disability is an umbrella term to include unusual difficulties with academic learning, including in written language, meaning reading, spelling, writing, and also mathematics, and also what the law terms as listening and speaking, which is rather an unclinical way of talking about problems with language processing and language production and language comprehension. So in research, for example, a researcher would not use the term, or shouldn't use the term, learning disability as a way of finding subjects for a research study about a particular disorder. Rather, they would have to do a more refined definition of the kind of learning disorder that they're interested in studying, because people with learning disabilities are so different from one another. You know, to use that term, and even though, for example, there's a journal called the Journal of Learning Disabilities, well, you know, people with learning disabilities are so different from one another that they have to be further defined by the type of academic learning problem that they're experiencing.
Okay, so you're saying that a learning disability really goes down into the type of challenge someone's having, whether it be language, you know, like within the language, you know, or whether it be math or whatever the case may be.
Yes.
Okay. So talking about dyslexia as one learning disability, it's a disorder that most people classify as making somebody read letters backwards and spell backwards. However, dyslexia is a problem within language, and it's deeper than that. So can you elaborate what dyslexia is and then what it is not?
Okay. Dyslexia to me is a descriptor rather than a diagnosis. And what it really refers to, if we're talking about a problem that is severe enough to be classified as a learning disability under federal law, we're talking about a very straightforward characteristic, which is that the person has unusual difficulty learning to read the words on the page, learning to translate print into language, and conversely, learning to translate language into print. And beyond that, dyslexia, the symptoms of dyslexia vary from individual to individual. However, that being said, the idea or the common myth that dyslexia involves some kind of reversal problem is not really true, because people can, or young kids can reverse letters in their writing, or seem to have problems with sequencing and directionality and reversals. But those problems are not characteristic of dyslexia. Rather, they are more a characteristic of a stage of learning to read and write. And what they signify is not a visual problem. What they signify is difficulty associating written symbols with language, with spoken language, and insufficient learning of the names for letters and numbers, and insufficient practice learning to associate the written symbols with their names and their sounds in the case of letters, and their concepts in the case of numbers. So that's one of about 10 common myths about dyslexia. Thank you for bringing it up.
No, absolutely. So learning disabilities have, dyslexia included, have a biological underpinning, have biological underpinnings. What, for dyslexia, if there is any, what are the biological underpinnings?
Okay, there are documented biological underpinnings for word recognition problems or dyslexia, and those biological underpinnings are genetically associated, or associated with genetic risk in about half the cases in which dyslexia occurs. In the other half, there are no designated genetic markers, but it is true that that dyslexia tends to run in families, that dyslexia does have documented genetic influences. It's also true that dyslexia has, about in equal parts, influences from the environment, and there's usually a mix of causal factors with dyslexia. But what do those genetic markers cause? They seem to cause differences in the brain's ability to form connections between the speech centers of the brain and the center for remembering printed words. So in order to learn to read, kids have to build pathways between the speech centers and then this center, specialized center in the back of the brain that is going to be responsible for remembering printed words and recognizing them automatically. So what happens in the dyslexia, in the dyslexic brain, if you will, is a slow and inefficient building of pathways between, especially a speech center called, or we'll say that the speech center that's responsible for being sensitive to the sounds in spoken words and the form of names for words and names for printed symbols, if you will, and this specialized center in the back of the brain that has to be that has to learn and remember the forms of printed words. So in essence, you could say the dyslexic brain is very slow to build the pathways that that normally developing brains will build with enough experience and instruction.
For somebody that has acquired an injury later in life, brain injury, concussion, and they have learning challenges, can dyslexia be one of their learning challenges, or is it more acquired as a child?
Yeah. By definition, dyslexia is a developmental disorder. It is not the consequence of brain injury later in development, although there is a rare condition that occurs sometimes with very specific kinds of strokes or with head injuries called alexia, where a person who has already learned to read loses the ability to learn to read, either loses the ability to recognize words in print or loses the ability to comprehend what they're reading. And that's a different kind of disorder that's associated usually with aphasia and brain injury from one source or another. So dyslexia is definitely a developmental disorder, and one of the most interesting lines of research ongoing now is detecting in very little kids the precursors of dyslexia, especially if there's a family history. So there is a whole research effort going on to identify kids who are having trouble distinguishing the sounds of speech that are going to distinguishing those problems with speech processing, that is the ability to differentiate the speech sounds of their own language. That's where the problem originates. And providing therapies for very little kids designed to remediate that problem of insensitivity to the speech sounds in their first language. So that's not a widespread type of intervention at this point, but generally speaking, we can screen little kids, 3 and 4-year-olds, for the precursors of dyslexia, and there are therapeutic interventions for preschoolers that help them be ready to learn to read when instruction becomes more formal when they enter kindergarten typically.
Okay. So there are, like you said, screeners for children starting at like age 3 or 4. When parents realize that there's some type of issue going on with their child in learning, reading, spelling, what symptoms should they look out for if it's dyslexia?
All right, the symptoms vary. So for example, there is no one set of symptoms that all kids will manifest who are going to have trouble learning to read the words. However, some of the key ones are, number one, the student really has trouble learning to recognize the alphabet names and forms, and finds that the mystery. And for example, if the parent is reading to the student, to their child, and wants to expose them to alphabet books, the child just doesn't compute. Another sign is the child might have delays in speech development, because about half of the kids, from what I've read lately, about half of the kids who have delayed speech and language development will also experience dyslexia. Another sign is perhaps mixing up words, because this central problem that we call a phonological problem, which has to do with processing the speech sound system of the language, can manifest itself in kids mixing up words and not being able to keep the names of things straight. Now, all kids have some manifestations of that early on because it's a part of the normal process of learning language. But where you might notice something amiss, if you're a parent in tune with your child, is that this child of yours may persist in confusing names and confusing names for things much longer than other kids. And where it's sort of cute originally, when it goes on and on and on, that's when you think something's a little different here. Let's see what else. When it comes to entering kindergarten, I mean, that's where the symptoms of dyslexia can become quite obvious, especially in the area of sensitivity to speech sounds and being able to notice and remember the individual sounds in words. So a dyslexic student typically does not enjoy wordplay, does not enjoy those games where they have to match the first sounds in words and then match those first sounds to letters and on from there.
Okay. So it's a lot of different things.
Yes.
Yes. There's no one general.
There's no one thing.
Right.
But we do have very good screening tests now if schools are using them, and if diagnosticians are using them. We have very good screeners that help us predict who's going to have a problem with beginning reading. So we can identify risk for dyslexia before students are asked to engage in formal learning of reading. We can build up those prerequisite skills of being more sensitized to the speech and words, and being familiar with the alphabet, and being able to take sounds apart and put sounds together, and also begin to associate sounds with the letters. So all of that's going on in kindergarten, and if kids are having unusual difficulty with those things, they should be given more intensive help right away.
Right. And where do you get these, or where, I guess maybe give us some names, or where do people have these screeners? So would it be in like a special education school, obviously speech therapists, psychologists?
Well, this is my campaign in life, okay? I think every school and every kindergarten teacher and every intervention person and every speech and language person should be working as a team to screen kids. This should not be a mystery. It should not be something that only the special education staff can do. Kindergarten teachers should be given professional development in the use of simple screening instruments, and then how to interpret the findings. Screening kids with good scientifically based instruments should take, in kindergarten, no more than 10 minutes per student. And then if a student is flagged as having unusual problems with these early predictive skills, they should be given a more thorough diagnostic screener for their ability to perform these phonological awareness tasks and their alphabet knowledge. And also part of that should be screening for their oral language abilities, because dyslexia in many cases doesn't exist in a so-called pure form. It coexists with other conditions. So maybe about a third of kids who are going to experience the symptoms of dyslexia also and executive function problems. About a third of them also will have unusual problems with learning to write and form the letters and spell, and we call that dysgraphia. About a third to a half of them are also going to have problems with oral language comprehension and expression. So dyslexia, while we can define what it is, pure form, it's just dyslexia, maybe in a third of the kids whom it affects. And it is common for dyslexia, the symptoms of dyslexia, to be accompanied by something else as well.
So when we get into the treatment of dyslexia, there's a wide scope, and like you did say, obviously schools and so forth, this is your area of specialty and expertise, is what you've been doing your entire career. But the language systems that are affected with, or someone who has dyslexia, are reading, writing, spelling. Can you, and this can be broad, but can you give just a general overview of how these systems are tackled to help a person with dyslexia improve or learn to compensate for their difficulties?
Yes. Well, let's start with this very important point, which is that dyslexia is a language-based disorder. The treatments address language processing. So this is the way these language systems line up. Reading depends on certain oral language proficiencies. Spelling also depends on the same oral language proficiencies, also requires better memory for printed words than reading does. So it's more difficult to learn how to spell because it requires a more exact memory for the printed form of a word. Writing depends on the ability to spell, to form letters, the ability to juggle in one's mind what one wants to say, as well as the ability to transcribe what one wants to say into printed form. So written expression involving, the writing down ideas is extremely demanding of language abilities and coordination of brain systems of in the mind and in the hand, if you will. So there's kind of a pyramid of reading depending on oral language, spelling being associated with the same abilities as reading, but additional memory factors as well, and writing being the most demanding form of language expression and the most likely to be affected by any problems in that hierarchy.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
That makes sense to me.
All right.
So there are a lot of different ways to go in terms of treatment for dyslexia. Obviously, there are more, there's systematic ones, there's, different programs. So kind of there's a gamut of a lot of different things out there. Somebody, who's a pioneer in the field and has come up with or has been involved with Letters and Language Live, so literacy-based intervention programs, specifically with teachers and teaching them how to screen and all of that. What do you think is the most effective way to treat dyslexia?
Okay. Well, there again is an umbrella concept, and it's called structured literacy, which is the heart of remediating dyslexia. And what structured literacy refers to is both the content that we have to teach students to understand and process automatically, and also the teaching methodology. So let's start with the content. Structured literacy interventions teach students very explicitly about the structure of language, and that includes the sounds that make up our language, the way we represent those sounds in print, the syllable structures that we represent in print, and something called the morphemes, or the meaningful parts that our print system represents. So to teach someone to read and write, let's just keep to English right now, we have to teach about sounds, syllables, and meaningful parts of words and how they are represented in print. And all of that is something we teach with a method called explicit, systematic, cumulative instruction. And that means that we present one concept at a time, we build one concept on another, we provide a lot of practice so that the student can internalize each association between print and speech. We give deliberate practice applying what's been taught in the lesson to reading and writing. We teach reading and writing as two sides of the same coin. We teach, we pair oral language with written language as often as is necessary. If the instruction is good, we provide immediate corrective feedback to the student so that the student can experience success. If a teacher or clinician knows what they're doing, they will set the student up for success and for successful practice. Or as we like to say, perfect practice results in accurate and automatic learning of print to speech correspondences. It doesn't do any good for a student to stumble and make lots of errors and be confused. We want to avoid that.
Of course.
Yeah. So it's really important that the teacher know in their own mind that the path to proficiency. And that's where my work comes in, because I view the responsibility of the teaching profession as responsibility for ensuring that students with symptoms of dyslexia, first of all, are taught in a way they can learn in the regular classroom. So that's what the LETTERS professional development is all about, is bringing this science to the regular classroom so that students with these symptoms don't experience overwhelming failure out of the starting gate. And that's the big risk here. We want the teacher to recognize what's going on and to make sure that the student has instruction that is intensive enough and structured enough and that is focused on the right stuff so that the student can make progress and can understand that even though they may learn differently or more slowly. And in my view, it's not that the learning process with dyslexia is different from what a normally progressing student goes through. It's that the student goes through it much more painstakingly and much more slowly. But what the brain has to learn to do is the same thing. It's not that the dyslexic brain, is being asked to learn how to read in some sort of different way. That's a myth. Because what you have to do basically is build these pathways. Now, the dyslexic brain in a severe case may try to build alternate pathways or employ the left cerebral hemisphere to support and whatever. But that pattern is associated with slow and laborious reading all the way through. So it's, the brain tries to do compensatory pathways, but it doesn't work all that well. And what we're striving to do is replicate the normal learning process for the dyslexic brain but it may take, you know, dozens or even hundreds of exposures to a pattern or a word or the way the print system works for the dyslexic brain to grasp it. And one of the things we know is that even though this can be, in the most severe cases, a very painstaking process for a person to go through, especially learning to spell and write, it's certainly possible for a person to overcome a lot of the most challenging aspects of the learning disorder. And the person, I mean, as in your case, right? The person can learn to manage their reading and writing challenges in a way that enables them to go on with their lives and learn to do what they're most comfortable with to find their niche, and
Right.
then to be productive and to experience a lot of satisfaction out of their special interest and their special talent. But dyslexia doesn't go away. It's a lifelong condition that a person has to deal with. And so, you know, there's no magic bullet. And again, there are a lot of myths, and there are a lot of, unfortunately, I think, exploitative therapies that are offered to people, niche therapies that have no grounding in science. And I would just advise the audience here to be aware that there are a lot of people out there who are, in my view, unethical, and who are promoting therapies that just have been contradicted by science, or that are unsupported by science. So what I've described as a therapeutic approach is the way to go: structured literacy instruction, and please avoid the hocus pocus.
I agree with that full on. Someone who's had my own set of issues and know the whole thing when it comes to treatment and hocus pocus versus not hocus pocus. And I think it's really important to just get down to it and just, you know, just get it all done and do it in the right way, and don't go do this all roundabout.
I mean, maybe we should say more about what the hocus pocus is. The hocus pocus therapies, that is, those that are contradicted by science or not supported, include A, vision therapies, okay, B, general cognitive therapies that are not targeted at language processing per se, C, peripheral things like, you know, sensory motor therapies that don't target language function, you know, vitamins. I mean, you can look at stuff that's out there, sensory motor therapies. Well, maybe sensory motor therapies help with sensory motor problems, but you know, I've seen it all, and
Sure.
Parents are easily victimized, and you know, do your homework before buying into some fringe claim out there about, you know, turmeric, whatever.
There's a lot of it, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we have some questions from our community now, and most of them, or at least some of them, don't cover necessarily dyslexia, but obviously all under the umbrella of dyslexia and learning disabilities. So our first question is, how can dysgraphia affect a child if they can read, but they have difficulty with aspects of writing, organizing thoughts, spelling, handwriting, and fine and gross motor skills?
Well, dysgraphia often coexists with dyslexia, but sometimes it exists just unto itself. And it's extremely frustrating and debilitating, and also under-recognized. I mean, we fought and fought to get the word dyslexia into the national vocabulary, and now we need to do that with dysgraphia. A sort of pure dysgraphia is much less common, but it does exist, and it's I've had clients in the past who are affected by this. And also there has been a lot more research, thanks to Virginia Berninger at the University of Washington, who is probably the leading researcher. She's now retired, but if I could do a show and tell, her book is the one that has the most to say for those of you who want to delve into the science and what the science does and doesn't say, and what her arguments are about how to help a student with dysgraphia. This is the best, Berninger and Wolf, published by Brooks Publishing. So a student with dysgraphia really must have accommodations and someone to help them use technology, to be able to dictate, to be able to really use technology to write, as you. I've had students who actually just for written expression have so much trouble forming words with a pen or pencil that it's almost a useless form of expression. And then learning to use the computer by even managing a keyboard is also very difficult. But it can be done. And now with speech to text technology, it's much more possible for a person to dictate and have what they say come out in written form that is readable by others. Sometimes a person may need additional help with editing to polish the work, but that now is much more possible. Language by computer, much more possible than it was.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I have one of my best friends. He met him actually at Wheaton College, but he has dysgraphia. And until I really started learning about the field of speech, language, dyslexia, dysgraphia, learning disabilities, and all of that, I then realized, oh, now I know why he has trouble with his handwriting. I never put two and two together until I had learned about the disorder.
Well, and then I would say a word of caution. One of the complexities in diagnosing dysgraphia is that handwriting is not taught very well in a lot of schools. So there are a lot of kids' handwriting is, excuse my language, god awful, because they have not been taught how to form the letters. And I've also seen many students with terrible handwriting whose problems were remediated by a good clinical intervention fairly late, a sixth grade or seventh grade. Diana King, who founded Kildonian School, which now no longer exists, could show me in case after case how so-called dysgraphia could be fixed. But so in a genuine case, the person just doesn't respond very well to otherwise good instruction.
Right.
And so let's talk about spelling for a moment. What about just a spelling problem? The person can form the letters, but the spelling is terrible. Well, this is so under-recognized as a problem and tend to diminish the importance of real spelling disability, but it does exist. So people who have that often have a subtle kind of phonological problem, but more importantly, the center of the brain that relies on accurate memory for printed words it just isn't up to speed. And this can be very debilitating and very embarrassing for people, and very hard to remediate altogether. So if remediation is successful, typically the person becomes good enough at reading to manage. But spelling disorder just is still very difficult, because the person has to have proofreading help. But it's a very real problem.
Absolutely. Our next question is, what have you learned about using assistive technology as a tool to support learners who have dyslexia?
Okay, well, it's not really my area of expertise, because one of the things I've learned is that technology can be introduced too early, before the remedial instructional process has been thoroughly tried and implemented. It's not a substitute. Using technology is not a substitute for good remediation. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid that people rely on it too much as a substitute. My view of technology is a good ancillary support, and there are lots of technology advances now that are very helpful to people. One is certainly being able to listen to books on tape, mm-hmm. and the services that Learning Ally provides, taped texts for people whose reading may be adequate but very slow, way too slow to enable them to cope with college level reading, for example, or more advanced high school level reading. So that's great, being able to dictate and bypass the laborious nature of writing, being able to use organizational tools and graphic organizers and note-taking devices. All of those technologies now are very advanced. So that's great. Also, there are some good early learning tools that are technology-based that help little kids learn to improve their phonological awareness. Aerobics is one of those, for example. It's been around for a while with good research behind it. There's some good learning tools. Mind Play is one for young kids to improve their decoding abilities. There are tools for older kids that are my program for adolescents, Language Live, is technology based, but it's a blended learning model where older students can improve their word recognition by using the online component. But there's no substitute for a teacher interacting with a group around the reading of a text. So it's a combination of a teacher leading kids through text reading and the comprehension skills that are necessary for that, and for written response to reading, with technology, sort of a technology platform surrounding all of that. To me, no substitute for a teacher interacting with a group of students who need the advantage of using language in structured discussion and shared reading of a text.
Right.
Okay.
Those are all great. That's a great response.
Okay.
So our last question is, how does dyslexia get more pronounced when one is stressed or maybe anxious or have other emotional issues?
Well, stress and anxiety, first of all, are very common in people who experience dyslexia. And one of the most true, valuable descriptions of that is in a book by Philip Schultz called My Dyslexia, which was published in 2009. But Philip Schultz is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who wrote this wonderful book called My Dyslexia when his son was formally diagnosed, and he realized what was going on with him as well. But he describes the anxiety that he experiences and what interferes with his work. And he describes how anxious he becomes when the words just don't compute, and how he has to take breath, how he has to calm himself down, and how he has to breathe, and how he has to remind himself that eventually it will fall, the written words will fall into place. But he describes how debilitating it was when he was a kid in the classroom. So, one of the things I can say about it is it's really helpful for people to have a diagnosis and a description from a good clinician about what is affecting them, so they can objectify it and think, okay, this is my brain just not computing, speech to print, and those pathways being too slow for me, so that their image of what's going on with them is separated from their concept of themselves, who they are as individuals and as people. It's very important, that this is not the whole picture of what they can do and who they are.
Right.
That's really a relief.
Yeah.
And then it's so important that the people who work with them also have an accurate idea of what is affecting them, so they too don't, attribute the problem to some global attribute like not trying. That is the worst, right?
Right.
And people say that over and over again. Recognize that I am working harder than anybody else, that I have been trying, and I am trying harder, and I am exhausted by my effort, and I need breaks, and I need understanding, and I need empathy. So, and then I think psychotherapy for the anxiety, and then sometimes the depression and hopelessness that can come at certain points in person's life. Therapy can be very important. And then, as I started out saying, all people are not the same. So if you have a coexisting, and there may be other therapies that are necessary. So good clinical help is really important.
Yeah. I agree. Well, it was so lovely to speak with you.
All right, Alexandra.
Take care. Have a good day.
All right. Bye.
All right. Bye.